Welcome to the Enterprising Converzations, your small business watchtower. I'm your channel host, Rendani. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by my former mentor, my former employer, and later my business partner. He is none other than Dr. David Berger. Dr. David Berger, welcome. And one thing, you asked me a question as to, you wanted me to remind you as to how we met. So I just want to share with the viewers how we got to meet, because it's a very fascinating account of how we got to meet. I was a student leader at the technology Tshwane University, Technical Northern Gauteng. Yeah, that's the old name, the original name. In Soshanguve, I was a SASCO member. I was an SRC member representing SASCO in the student council. And this particular day, there was a fellow student who was a comrade, who was a SASCO comrade activist. And the name of the student was Andrew Matiza. He disappeared for some time at the Technicon. I couldn't see him. I used to see him at meetings and when we had protests and so forth. And one day he rocked up at the staff administration block where I was working. And I asked him, Andrew, what happened to you? And Andrew told me that, you know what, I've been excluded. And then I attended to Andrew because he was financially excluded until he was registered. And what prompted me to work on his case for the whole day was that his grades were exceptionally good. And after that, Andrew went for an internship. He met Dr. David Berger, was doing recruitment for an infrastructure company, Infracom, I think. And he got hired by Dr. David Berger as an intern. And Dr. David Berger said, you know what, I want you to refer me to somebody like you who has got your background. At the time, I had finished my studies and I was looking for a job. And that's when Andrew hooked me up with Dr. David Berger. So I helped him to remain at university, and he helped me to get a job. That's how I got to meet Dr. David Berger. So Dr. David Berger, welcome. Joining us from the USA. What is it, Pennsylvania, or what is that?
I'm in Maryland.
Maryland. Is that, did you move to Maryland, or is that you've been staying there all along?
Oh no, it's came here from South Africa.
Okay.
We're not from here. But, no. It's a nice little state.
Okay. All right. No, that's great. Then let me, on that note, let me allow you to introduce yourself formally to the viewers.
Okay, well, as you mentioned, we first met a very long time ago. It's 30 years now.
Yeah.
So now I'm 76 years old now, but I'm still active. But just as a short biography, I finished my PhD in South African history in 1983, and I was the first American to get a PhD in South African history. There was not that much interest in Africa in those days, so particularly not much in South Africa either. But then I moved to South Africa in 1997 after the democratic election in 94. And I've been working in South Africa ever since, though when the pandemic started, I was in the US and I couldn't come back to South Africa. And now I'm kind of old and tired of it. So with modern technology, I'm still working. And when I have a meeting, we use the Zoom and similar technology. So I can be here and there at the same time.
Thank God for the technology. So tell me, because you just kind of touched on the subject that I wanted to explore next. your involvement with South Africa, you were in the anti-apartheid movement. Your PhD on South African studies, and now I recall you mentioning that because I've also been struggling, to find out the connection. How exactly did you get involved with South Africa? How did you decide to do a PhD on South African studies?
Well,
and how did you get involved in the apartheid?
Okay, well, this is a bit of a long answer because I've been involved in a lot of things, but it was actually with stamp collecting that I got interested in Africa. And, on the stamps, there's always pictures of people and places. And I got curious as to who all these people and what these places were. And I did later learn more about some of them. I mean, for example, on Congo stamps, they'd have pictures of King Leopold. And I did later learn that he was rather a terrorist responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people, but he was celebrated on the stamps when the colony of Belgium. Then I started collecting stamps from Ghana, and there was pictures of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president. And I later learned that he went to university in the United States at a university not far from where I grew up. So that's how I got interested in Africa. And when I'd read the newspaper, even though I was young at the time, if there was something about Africa, which was rare, occasionally, I would read the articles. So in 1964, I read some articles about Angola struggling against Portugal for independence. And being a young, rather politically naive person, I thought that Agostinho Neto, the leader of the MPLA, leading that struggle, kind of like our George Washington, who led the struggle in the U.S. against, for independence from England. So I thought Agostinho Neto must be the good guy, the George Washington of Angola. So then I discovered that the U.S. government was supporting Portugal. And one of the big American oil companies, Gulf Oil, was actually funding Portugal with the revenues from the oil. So I was disturbed and decided I better do something about it. So I started a boycott of that oil company. But I was young. I didn't even have a car. But a friend of mine had a car, and whenever we would be out driving, if he needed gas, he knew not to stop at that gas station from that oil company, because if he stopped, he'd get a lecture on Angola, and he didn't want to hear the lecture again. So that was my effective boycott, was one person not buying at that gas station. That's how I got started. It's how I became an activist. And then I started graduate school, and I decided to do African studies in graduate school. In 1974, I started. I was going to study Angola. I was still interested in Angola. But after Angola became independent in 74, that same year, there was too much fighting there. So that wasn't really possible. But I decided then to switch to South Africa. My PhD advisor was Professor Tselwani Kato, if you remember. Kato, you knew Kato. So after 94, he became the deputy and then the vice chancellor at Vista. So he was South African from Matatiele. And one of the, he died when he was young. I don't know if you remember.
I remember very well. How can I not?
It was very untimely, but on his grave in Pretoria, he had his favorite slogan, which was, if lions had historians, then the hunters would not be the heroes.
Pardon, come again?
If lions had historians, hunters would not be heroes.
Oh, hunters would not be heroes.
Yes.
Okay, so I get that.
It's usually the the stronger that writes the history.
Mhm.
So, if you
Because
at
you
that
can
time,
influence.
hmm?
Yeah, because you can narrate the history from your own angle, isn't it?
Yes. So most
Yeah,
South African history was written from the colonial perspective. So,
absolutely.
so when I was
Mm,
in graduate school, to read something about Africans or what Africans did was
mm,
difficult. But fortunately, with Cato as a professor, what there was, he directed me in the right direction. But
mm,
basically, almost all history was written from a colonial perspective.
mm.
Uh,
Absolutely, just like it was with everything else. I
right.
mean, in South Africa, almost everything, the design of the town it was designed to suit colonial culture and way of life. So we just had to fit in. That's how it was. From the English to the Afrikaners, there was no appreciation of the culture of the native people.
Yeah. So,
Positive. Mm,
but Professor Cato, of course, had a totally different perspective, and that's how I was taught. So
mhm,
it's even one of my current projects is a history of a traditional community in a rural area that you'll
mhm.
never find even mentioned in a history book. It's
No, no,
history
no
is
chance. No chance.
basically
Look.
non-existent,
Mm,
but it's an interesting
yeah.
history. So when I finish that, you can invite me back and I can talk about that
I'll be,
in a
I'll be
detail.
more than glad to talk about
So, but I'll mention a
it.
few things as I get to it. But in any case, that's in the 1980s and early 90s. I was very involved in multiple projects. So, for example, I
Mhm,
was president of a group called Education Fund for Southern Africa, which I started at the request of Johnny Makatini, who was the ANC foreign minister at the time, he was
mhm,
foreign minister before Thabo Mbeki took up that position in the late 80s. So I had met him in New York at the UN. And so I said, well, what could I do? And he said, well,
mhm,
start a scholarship fund. We've got all these young people, uh, former political prisoners, MK fighters who were at a school in Tanzania, Solomon Mashlangu Freedom College. And they need a
mhm.
university to go to. So at that time, most of the university slots that they could get were in East Germany and Soviet Union, and they wanted to diversify. But we started a program in the
Mhm,
US to bring young people from South Africa to the US. So that kept
mhm,
me busy for quite a long time. So we spent most of my time doing fundraising and
mhm,
begging for whatever needed to be done to support this small group of students. So
mhm,
that was one thing, but I was also involved with a group called Labor Against Apartheid, and we supported solidarity campaigns with COSATU. So it was very
mhm.
interesting. And in the mid 80s, if you remember, there were general strikes.
Yes.
And in one of those general strikes, there was an American company that fired all of its workers who were COSATU members. So
Mm.
we were contacted, and so
And that was a company that was invested in South Africa.
yes, they had several factories in the Johannesburg area. Crown Court and Conceal was
Mhm,
the name of the company, and so they
mhm,
had factories there. Fired all of
mhm,
the COSATU workers. So
mhm,
we were contacted, and so the headquarters of that American company was near Philadelphia, where I was based, and so we contacted the union that represented the workers in the U.S.
mhm,
And so we prepared a picketing and protest campaign against the company. And the union went to the company officials and told them that either you reinstate the workers in South Africa or there's going to be trouble.
mhm.
They would be picketed and boycotted and whatever we could do. So guess what happened? They rehired all of the workers.
Wow, what a sweet victory! It was
So
a great victory.
it was hard to score victories, but that was one of
What
them. So, and
Yeah,
I did organize speaking tours for ANC representatives in Philadelphia, and I organized a speaking tour for the ambassador from Zimbabwe in Philadelphia to talk about Southern Africa and regional issues. I was involved in the disinvestment campaign, convincing companies to move out of South Africa. And in '94, I was an IEC official. If you remember, at that time, there was voting in various countries. So there was a voting site in Philadelphia. I was an IEC, an Electoral Commission official responsible for the site in Philadelphia.
That must have been very fulfilling for you after all that work. But now, thank you for that background, which really helped a lot, because I think I even missed some of those details that you've just explained. Even from all the years that I spent with you, some of the details I never got to know. Yeah. But I want to move on to your activities now. When you moved to South Africa in 1997, especially, what were the kind of activities that you were involved with?
Oh, well, I can just tell one more little story from then.
Okay.
After the election in '94, we had gotten American companies to disinvest, and there were laws on the books banning companies from doing business in South Africa. Or for example, like state pension funds would their money out of companies that were in South Africa. So after the election, those laws were still on the books. So the ANC contacted us and said, well, now all those things that you did, you got to now undo them. So, and you have to put down your picket signs, put on a tie, go back to those companies and say, we got you to disinvest, now we want you to come back.
Now we want them to come and invest. Interesting.
So it was, it was tough for me because I was a former union official and union organizer involved in labor issues. Now I had to put on a tie and talk business. So it was a bit of a transition, but when I did come to South Africa in '97, then I was more in the management side. But I had to try to not change any of my pro-union, pro-worker values. So you can comment on that. I hope I fulfilled that for as best as I could.
Yeah.
But so you were asking about then what did I do in South Africa?
Yeah, your activities, especially the work with Vista, the reconstruction and development related work. Of course, you were doing that as a for business, as a consultant, but still contributing to the reconstruction and development of the country.
It was actually my first project in South Africa, and this is related to Vista work, was in Mpumalanga with David Mabuza, who was then the MEC for Education in Mpumalanga, later became deputy president. So, but at that time he was the MEC for Education, and the ANC had a policy of replacing, if you remember, what was called Bantu education.
Yes.
An education based on critical thinking skills. But but there were very few people in South Africa that had any idea what critical thinking skills and how you teach those. So we organized a project with a group of an American teacher organization, sponsored a project in Mpumalanga to train teachers there in how to teach critical thinking skills, even in a classroom which was very, very overcrowded. So it was, that kind of got me ready. But then when I did move to South Africa, we were at Vista.
Excuse me, please. I just want to comment on the point that you made, that it was very difficult then to find somebody who knew what it meant to teach people to have critical skills. And I wanted to comment that we used to shout the slogans of People's Education during COSAS and National Education Coordinating Committee. But guess what? we shouted those slogans, but we didn't know the alternative. We could critique Bantu education. We knew what was wrong, but how to transform the curriculum to reflect those values of people's education was difficult. And guess what? I experienced critical thinking skills when I got into I do mention it as well in this in the book that I've just authored, the Balance Sheet Dialogues. But that's a very interesting thing that you just mentioned. Yeah, you may carry on.
Well, it's and in Mpumalanga, one of the people that was involved in the project was the member of the provincial parliament who was the chair for the education committee. And he told me the same thing. He said, yeah, we used to shout these slogans and demand critical thinking skills and an end to Bantu education. And he told me all about that. And then he said to me, what is critical thinking skills? So he spent a lot of the time traveling with us and in the activities because he was also wanting to learn. It was a very successful project. And we trained a small group of teachers who were then trainers. And I did later find out that some of them had become, subject supervisors. So they were able to use their skills to help with other teachers. But at Vista, the challenge at Vista was that it was a real apartheid child. It was started by Broederbond professors from UNISA in the early 80s. And it was started as a correspondence school. And the mission of Vista was to give degrees to African teachers in rural areas so that they could get a raise. But it was really designed to kind of keep them busy and out of politics. So you could be a math teacher with a very low level of skill in math teaching, go to Vista, get a degree in biblical studies, which was the #1 course, and get a raise. It didn't help you as a math teacher, but you could get a raise. And of course, biblical studies, the purpose of those courses was to teach you that God says apartheid is a good idea. So that was the Vista that we got involved with. It's it's the issue of education. If I hope I'm not taking up too much of your time here.
No, look, in terms of time, I'm thinking, no, I'm enjoying the discussion and I would like us to go on. I'm thinking we need to have a two-part because we might run out of time, but what we'll do then, you can maybe send me an invitation from your side, or I can do that. Probably your Zoom version has got longer talking time than mine. I don't know. It's the same. Okay.
We'll see how we go. So, but just as background on the education issue, if we look at South Africa at the end of the 19th century, and around 1870 or so, it was a rural economy, pretty much, very little else before the discovery of minerals. And most the colonial piece of South Africa was relatively small. Most African communities were still independent, but that rapidly changed over the last quarter of the 19th century. So by the early 90s, African communities had all been incorporated into the colonial society. And within the white rural areas, because of large families, there was a growing poverty, particularly amongst rural Afrikaners. Now, this was seen as a problem, and South Africa had to make major decisions. What kind of a future would the country have? Given now that it's becoming an industrial country, the world had changed. What would South Africa be like? but all these white people were poor. So, and I have a little quote I'm going to read you. This is from a member of the Cape Colony Parliament, and he was talking about this issue. And this is what he said: that all other matters sink into insignificance when brought into contrast with the question of keeping the white population of this country up to the standard of a dominant race. The white population was in a minority in the country, but we must be a dominant minority if we are to live here at all. And if our brethren were to sink into the slough, the mud, as we saw them doing, it would be impossible for the rest of us to maintain our position of dominance. That was J.X. Merriman, a member of the Cape Parliament, who later became a premier in that colony. He was a very prominent person, and he put that issue on the table, and government needed to decide how were they going to deal with these kinds of issues, because a large number of white people were basically had no better education than the African population. So, of course, what they did is that they decided to put into place a what was called differential education system. One system for whites, one system for blacks. So for whites, they wanted to have a world-class education, 8 years compulsory education, which was a lot when you look in the 1890s. So, and for Africans, they could keep going to mission school, which taught a lot of very important things like how to brush your teeth and basic literacy, but it was not a competitive education in an industrial economy. So it took some years, but the white population became educated. So this over time, what they were able to do by a set of white empowerment programs to push the white population above the black population in the context of economic growth. Had they not done that, if there had been an equal education, then the country would have looked very different. But they chose for them a future that as what you grew up in. So, and then in the 1950s, the government did two critical things. One was they took over the missions, formalized Bantu education on the basis of a principal idea called fundamental pedagogy, which was based on education philosophy of the fascist countries, Mussolini and Adolf Hitler in Germany. So, and the idea of fundamental pedagogics was that the problem with children in the classroom is that they ask questions. And that interferes with proper education. Because proper education means that you memorize what we tell you is the proper answer to the question. So you would have been schooled in your youth in memorization of a curriculum that had to be mastered if you wanted to pass the tests and move on. So this was, that was the kind of education, that was what Vista was all about. So when we arrived at Vista, it was biblical studies, Afrikaans were the two major courses. And they had a business school, but so they in the business class you could learn what was a business plan. You could pass a test. What are the 5 elements of a business plan? But to write a business plan, nothing. So part of fundamental pedagogics was the separation of theory and practice. So that universities taught theory, but heaven forbid that you should actually learn how to do anything.
That's terrible.
And technicons were practice, but it wasn't. It was just how to do something, but not to be able to understand what you were really doing, theoretically or generally. So there was, in fact, a science of separating theory and practice. It was something that you could study. And I even met someone, a professor at Vista, who did his PhD on how to properly separate theory and practice.
I remember you used to joke a lot yourself about that.
So yeah, when he told me that was his PhD dissertation, I was sure he was pulling my leg. But then to my amazement, I realized that he was dead serious. So this was
it was a sad joke.
Yes, it's so this was the context that we were dealing with. So now this was what I had learned in Mpumalanga and learned from research, was that this was what we had to confront. So the idea of the VISTA programs, which we called the Center for Innovation and Productivity, the way to